All aboard! Good morning, boys and girls. My name is Miss Brittany, and I'm your teacher. This is your host, Miss Valerie. Today, we will learn about the elements of a tall tale.
Today's lesson is titled John Henry, and by the end of the lesson, we will be able to identify tall tales as a type of fiction, demonstrate familiarity with the tall tale John Henry, identify the characters, setting, and plot of John Henry, identify exaggeration and larger-than-life characters as characteristics of tall tales, and identify the exaggerations in John Henry.
Let's go ahead and get started. In the read aloud, you will hear, people would tell about these still-driving men and their amazing feats. Say the word feats with me. Feats.
Feats.
Miss Valerie, do you know the meaning of the word feats?
I think feats are like accomplishments.
That's right. Feats are achievements that require courage or strength. Let's use it in a sentence. Climbing to the top of the mountain was an amazing feat. Have you ever completed or accomplished a feat, Miss Valerie?
I have. I once built a very complicated Lego structure.
Wow, that's an amazing feat. Have you ever completed or accomplished a feat? Try to use the word feat when you tell about it. One more time. What's the word we've been talking about? Perfect.
Boys and girls, can you tell me what you've already learned about tall tales? That's right. If you said that they are humorous, often exaggerated adventures, you are right.
Today's tall tale, John Henry, is like many other folk tales that were first told orally or shared by word of mouth. Do you know that means these tales weren't written down for a long time and probably became more exaggerated with each telling?
Actually, I did learn that in previous lessons.
Today, we will add to the anchor chart behind us to demonstrate our learning.
Notice the column on the left has titles Characters, Setting, and Plot. A character is who or what the story is about. The setting is when and where the story takes place. And the plot is a summary of the main events in the story.
Boys and girls, we also have a row for realistic details and exaggerations. Realistic details are details in a tall tale that could happen in real life. An exaggeration in a tall tale makes the main character seem larger than life. He or she is always bigger, stronger, smarter, and faster than real people.
Let's review a few of these details from our previous lessons on tall tales.
In Paul Bunyan, he was credited with creating many of the natural landscapes in America.
But is it realistic that a man and an ox could straighten a river by pulling on each end?
No, that was an exaggeration we read in the tall tale Paul Bunyan.
Then we read the story of Pecos Bill, about a cowboy that was raised by coyotes and had many amazing adventures.
But did he really use a rattlesnake to lasso a cyclone?
No, that was another exaggeration that we added to our chart.
That's right. Today we will read another tall tale. Listen for more examples of exaggerations throughout the story. For many years, people believed that John Henry was a fictional character, but many historians now believe this tall tale may have some truth to it.
So how does it all begin?
As people continued to move westward during the settlement of our country, new transportation systems were being invented, and older transportation systems became faster and less expensive.
You mean they didn't just fly across the country?
Not yet. But one form of transportation that made traveling much easier was the railroad and trains. This image shows one of the first steam trains that traveled through the West. Look at this image. It shows workers laying train tracks. There were many railroad lines expanding west. Tracks were laid by thousands of workers. Tunnels were even dug right through mountains.
Wow, through mountains? That is an amazing feat. How did they lay the tracks?
The tracks were laid mostly by hand. Take a look at the mountains in this image. Do you think laying tracks here would be easy or difficult work?
That looks like difficult work to me.
Oh, it was, Miss Valerie. It definitely was. Soon, however, machines were invented that could do what people were doing, and the machines could do the work easier and faster. In fact, the main action in this story centers on John Henry's competition with a machine. Who do you think wins this competition, John Henry or the machine?
I can't wait to find out.
In the 1860s, the United States was growing quickly. Immigrants were pouring in, and railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry settlers west. One of the railroad companies was called the Chesapeake and Ohio, or the C&O for short. The C&O Railroad was named for the two bodies of water it was intended to connect, the Chesapeake Bay along the east coast and the Ohio River in the west.
Let's take a look at a map.
The map shows the location of the Ohio River and the Chesapeake Bay, where the C&O Railway Company derived its name. Let's keep reading. The engineers who planned the C&O Railroad had to overcome many challenges in order to get trains from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River. But no challenge was greater than this. They had to run their track through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were like a big wall that separated the east from the west. Sometimes, when the mountains were rolling, more like hills, the C&O workers were able to lay tracks over the top of them. Other times, they were able to lay track that zigzagged around the mountains, like a snake. But some mountains were too tall to go over and too big to go around.
So what did they do?
In those cases, the only solution was to dig a tunnel right through the mountain. Digging tunnels was dangerous work. The tunnels were dark and poorly ventilated. That means that there was barely enough fresh air inside the tunnels for the workers to breathe. Many workers were killed by sudden cave-ins. To dig the tunnels as fast as they could, railroad workers worked in teams of two. One man would crouch down and hold a steel spike. Then the other man would hit the spike with a big hammer. The first man would twist the spike as much as he could. Then his partner would hit the spike with his hammer again. The two men would work together, banging and twisting until they had driven the spike deep into the rock. Then they would pull out the spike, move to another spot, and start digging a new hole. After a while, the rock would be full of holes, like a piece of Swiss cheese. Next, the Dynamite Men would take over. The Dynamite Men would pack dynamite into the holes and detonate the explosives. Kaboom! The explosions would break up the solid rock into rubble. Then the workers would haul away the rubble, and then they would start digging again. To make the long, hard day's work go by faster, the railroad workers used to have contests. They would pick two teams and see which team could drive its spike farther into the mountains in a set amount of time. The winners of these contests became heroes. People would tell stories about these steel-driving men and their amazing feats. Another thing the railway workers did to pass the time while they worked was sing songs. Sometimes they would even sing songs about other still driving men. One of these still driving men was named John Henry. No one knew for certain where John Henry was from. Some said he was from Georgia. Some said he was from Tennessee. Others said he was a Virginia man. As it turns out, it seems likely that he was a former slave. He seems to have started working on the railroads sometimes after the end of the Civil War. For years, people thought John Henry worked on the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O line in what now is West Virginia. But now we think he more likely worked on the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia.
Let's take a look at a map.
As you can see, the state of Virginia is nestled between North Carolina and West Virginia. The state's topography is very diverse, ranging from the Tidewater, a coastal plain in the east with low marshlands and an abundance of wildlife near the Chesapeake Bay, to the Blue Ridge Mountains in the west, with the tallest mountain, Mount Rogers, reaching 5,729 feet.
Wow, that's a really tall mountain.
Let's keep reading. One thing we are sure of is that John Henry was a legend among railway workers. They sang a song that tells the story about how he was born with a hammer in his hand. John Henry became known as the most courageous man who ever worked on the railroad. Even as a young boy, he could do the work of a man.
That means that even as a boy, John Henry could do the work of older men. Do you think he really could? Or is this an exaggeration?
I think this is an exaggeration. They said he had never been defeated in a steel driving competition. They said he hit the spike so hard that sparks flew through the air. They said John Henry could swing a 10-pound hammer from sunup to sundown and not even get tired. At first, almost all of the work on the tunnels was done by hand by workers like John Henry. Eventually, however, this began to change. People invented machines that could do some of the work. One of the machines they invented was a steam drill. This was a drill that was powered by a steam engine. The first steam drills were pretty good, but they were not great. The steam drills could drive a spike into the mountain for sure, but not as well as two strong, experienced railway workers like John Henry and his partner. Over time, the machines got better and better, and they eventually began to replace the men who worked on the railroad tunnels. One day, the captain of John Henry's work team brought a steam drill to the work site. He bet that the steam drill could drive steel better than John Henry could. John Henry agreed to compete against the steam drill, and he swore he would do his best to beat it. John Henry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man, but before I let a steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, I'll die with a hammer in my hand."
Why does this text sound different than the rest of the text?
This is an excerpt from The Ballad of John Henry. A ballad is a kind of poem or song that tells a story.
Oh, so that's why I hear rhymes and repeated lines.
Exactly. Let's keep reading. The other railway workers roared. They were excited that John Henry had won. He had shown that a hard worker was better than a machine. But John Henry himself was in no condition to celebrate. He had worked so hard that he had suffered a heart attack. John Henry hammered in the mountains, and his hammer was striking fire. Well, he hammered so hard that it broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer, and he died. Oh, oh, he laid down his hammer, and he died. The railway men carried John Henry out of the tunnel. They laid him to rest with other workers who had died. But the legend of John Henry lived on. The C&O Railroad was completed a couple of years later, and for years to come, whenever locomotives went down, John Henry received a cheer as loud as a roar. They took John Henry down the tunnel, and they buried him in the sand. And every locomotive comes a-roaring by says, "Yonder lies a still driving man. Oh, oh, yonder lies a still driving man."
Wow, what a great story. John Henry really is a legend.
That's right. Boys and girls, do you know what a legend is? A legend is someone who is well known for doing something extremely well. A legend is also a story that is believed to be true, just like this one.
I heard one example of exaggeration in that tall tale.
You're right, Miss Valerie. Can you tell me what it was?
Well, I don't think John Henry was really born with a hammer in his hand.
Exactly. That's an exaggeration. Now, what are some things in this story that could have happened in real life?
I know. People really did lay railroad tracks. Also, people had the dangerous task of digging tunnels.
Very good. Those are realistic details.
Boys and girls, how is the John Henry tall tale different from the other tall tales you have heard?
That's right. John Henry was a real person. The story did not have as many adventures. John Henry did not create or invent anything in nature, and his story has fewer exaggerations. Let's add some of these details to our chart. First, let's identify our main character. Remember, a character is the who or what the story is about.
Boys and girls, who was the main character in our story today?
Yes, that's right. The main character was John Henry. Let's add that to our table.
And we've talked about the challenging terrain or the way the land was mountainous. So what can we say the setting was?
Boys and girls, do you remember? That's right. The setting is the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia.
Great. Let's add that to our table as well.
To summarize the plot of our story today, I'd say John Henry competes against the steam drill in driving steel. John Henry does an impossible job and beats the steam drill. However, his heart finally gives out.
What a great summary. It hits the overall main events of the story.
Moving along. We've already talked about realistic details and exaggerations, so let's add them to our chart.
The first detail is men worked in teams to lay railroad.
That is really how railroad tracks were laid. Let's add that to the realistic details section of our chart. What about a man was born with a hammer in his hand?
Again, I think that is impossible.
Right. That is an exaggeration. We will add that to our chart. Our last detail for today is people use dynamite to blast through mountains.
That sounds dangerous, but I think it could really happen.
Correct. We will add the last detail to the realistic detail section of our chart. Great job, everyone.
In our next lesson, we will read another tall tale and look for some of these same elements of tall tales.
Thank you for joining us today. All rights and credits from this lesson belong to Core Knowledge Language Arts. We would like to thank them for publicly sharing these materials. Use what you have learned today. Go tell someone at home about John Henry and his amazing feats.
Family members, for an extension activity, I encourage you to find a recording of the Ballad of John Henry from the public library or on the internet and listen to it with your child. As you listen, have your child explain the tall tale of John Henry in his or her own words.
And if you are interested in reading more about John Henry, check out these books. You can access these books at your local library or online.
Ain't Nothing But a Man, My Quest to Find John Henry by Scott Reynolds Nelson. John Henry, An American Legend by Ezra Jack Keats. And John Henry by Julius Lester.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you again soon.